Afternoon. I'm Julie Clark with University of California Cooperative Extension. I'd like to welcome each of you to the third of 5 lunchtime talks this week, co-sponsored by California Invasive Plants Council and University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with today's talk. You all are advised that this is being recorded today, and the links will be available in a few days. We also are asking you, we have 2 ways to communicate during the event. We ask that all questions be put in the Q&A area, and any sundry other information will either be shared or you can post in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Gary Bucciarelli is Director of Research at the UC Natural Reserve System's Stunt Ranch Biological Field Station, located in the heart of the Santa Monica Mountains in Los Angeles County. He works with freshwater ecosystems to understand how invasive species, drought, warming temperatures, and habitat loss are affecting amphibians and stream biodiversity. In his talk, he will discuss how stream biodiversity in California streams is impacted by invasive crayfish and how this ultimately affects human health, as well as what we can do to preserve our incredible and dwindling freshwater ecosystems. Welcome, Dr. Bucciarelli.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just ask, is it okay to start sharing my screen now? Is that fine? Yep.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, it's saying you need to stop sharing first. Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, I want to start by thanking the organizers for this opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm very excited to be here. And I'm going to talk about how an ecosystem like the stream shown in this image, which is found in Southern California. This is a stream in the Santa Monica Mountains. I'm going to talk about that region specifically, how these streams in Southern California provide incredible benefits to humans, and why we need to ensure they are protected from invasive species. So for those of you not familiar with the Santa Monica Mountains, well, first and foremost, I encourage you to come and visit because it's a remarkable, incredible resource that we have in California. This is a view from one of the peaks in the mountains. It's very green, you'll notice. Full disclaimer, this was taken prior to the droughts that started years ago in the mid-teens. And so it's not maybe this green right now, but it's still a remarkable view. The Santa Monica Mountains is situated against the coast. They actually run west to east here. It's got the larger urban area of Los Angeles on one side, the greater San Fernando Valley on the north side, the Oxnard Plain, which is largely agricultural, on the other side. It's pinned in by the Pacific, and then arguably one of the busiest freeways in the world runs on its northern border. So this white line is the perimeter of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, which is a national park, and it's the largest urban national park in the world, actually. It's approximately 180,000 acres. These are what the streams in the Santa Monica Mountains look like. I know it's kind of hard to believe that in Southern California we have water flowing like this, but it is true. It might not look like this right now, but in our winters, which we tend to get our rain in December and January, and sometimes up into March, they have flow like this. And these streams are what we call ephemeral. Ephemeral meaning they do not flow year round. If it flowed year round, we would call that a perennial stream. This is an ephemeral stream. And a stream like this is representative of stream habitat across Southern California. And I worked in streams like this across the Santa Monica Mountains in Greater California as a part of my PhD work, where I studied amphibians actually. But I actually, I started to look at stream biodiversity and how these environments actually are impacted by drought, invasive species, wildfire. And I still work on that and really trying to understand how environmental conditions like those and major events like wildfire, drought, and invasives shape the patterns of biodiversity in these ecosystems. When I talk about stream biodiversity, I'm talking about amphibians, which are the frogs and the salamanders and the newts. And I'm also talking about fish and aquatic insects too. So these streams tend to be extremely species rich and have a high amount of biodiversity, including aquatic insects or benthic macroinvertebrates. That's another technical term. Aquatic insects are indicators of stream health, and you can look at the biodiversity of these aquatic insects and understand how healthy a stream is. This image here shows you what one representative species might look like. Aquatic insects that rely on this stream habitat, they begin their lives in the stream. They are deposited as eggs by the adults. So this is an adult dragonfly. But before adult dragonflies are flying around and we're all kind of mesmerized by their captivating colors and beauty, they actually look like this in the streams. And odonates, you might hear me use this term today, odonates include dragonflies and the closely related damselflies that are fully aquatic in the larval stage and then become adults that fly around after they emerge from the streams. These ecosystems are really interesting for a lot of reasons. There's the biodiversity, there's the insect communities that are there. And these ecosystems provide numerous benefits to human health. And these are often referred to as green infrastructure or ecosystem services. And those benefits include water filtration, cooling, recreation. They are inherent to the functioning of this ecosystem, those ecosystem services. It's a natural process that occurs as a result of the ecosystem being intact. Green infrastructure is also important to urban habitats. This image is of Silver Lake in downtown Los Angeles. And their services you can imagine coming from this are shade, right? There's water filtration. There's an improvement to air quality because of the trees that take up CO2. If we actually look at the greater Los Angeles area, which includes the Santa Monica Mountains, that totals about 88,000 square kilometers. And to give you perspective of what that translates to, that's approximately 16.4 million football fields in size. The ecosystem services, the benefits of green infrastructure in that area, that 88,000 square kilometers, The benefits of that green infrastructure amount to over $85 billion in estimated services to human well-being. That's huge. And the question I have for you all today is, what if ecosystem services like that are compromised by invasive species? And what I mean by this is, what if the plants and animals, the native plants and animals, can't do the normal things that they would do when there are no introduced, non-native, or invasive species? And we just need to get some vernacular straight here real quick. Invasive species is a term that is different from non-native, which is different from introduced. Introduced can mean that a species that is not a species found here in its native distribution was introduced here. Coqui frogs, yellow mustard, ivy, lantana, there's lots of them here. They are non-native species. So introduced and non-native can be synonymous. An invasive species implies that that species, when it was introduced, has exploded in population numbers and become an invasive species. It is invasive because it takes over ecosystems. And I can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A if folks are interested about this idea of introduced species and when do they eventually become invasive? Do all introduced species become invasive? And this idea of lag effects that are associated with introduced and non-native species. But let's start by introducing you to this invasive species, which is found in streams and ponds and lakes in California. This is an invasive crayfish called the red swamp crayfish, or Procambarus clarkii. That's the Latin for it. What makes them invasive is that they are prolific breeders. They were introduced here in Southern California in the 50s or 60s, and they can breed 2-3 times a year. The females produce thousands of larvae. They did not evolve in this ecosystem. They have no natural predators as a result of that introduced context. They have no natural predators that consume them, leaving them to proliferate and have this exponential population growth. They're different from introduced or non-native at this point because they are now invasive. And what I want to talk about specifically is how this invasive crayfish, the red swamp crayfish, is affecting stream health and functioning. And by health, what I'm talking about is how intact the natural ecosystem remains. And by functioning, I'm referring to the inherent properties that occur within an intact ecosystem, like those green infrastructure, ecosystem services I talked about, water and air purification, but also disease suppression. And ecosystem services, green services are synonymous. Crayfish are actually a major concern in conservation. And as I said, they were translocated by humans. They have been introduced, they invaded and took over local ecosystems. No crayfish naturally occur in Southern California. And because there are no native species in SoCal, again, there's that lack of evolutionary history with crayfish. So native species don't really know how to compete with them. And this species specifically is one of the biggest and most detrimental invasive species in the world. The red here is where crayfish, red swamp crayfish, Procambarus clarkii, actually now occur through introductions. And the blue there on the map is their native range. They have been introduced to all continents except Australia and Antarctica. And to be quite honest, I wouldn't be surprised if one day they somehow figure out how to make it in Antarctica. They're that adapted to extreme conditions. In Southern California, these crayfish are actually ubiquitous. This map shows you these blue dots and these red dots. And they are community science data and museum records of localities where crayfish have been found. And crayfish are problematic for a couple of reasons. I've laid out that idea that there's no native predators of them. They are extremely prolific. Some of the negative outcomes as a result of their life history, the strategies that they have, is that they contribute to species decline. So they are extremely negative in their impacts to amphibian communities and stream biodiversity. They are incredibly difficult to manage because I will show you soon how they have to be manually removed from streams. There is no like sort of pesticide of sorts that can be added to the streams and, you know, kind of knock them out selectively. And another problem is they're omnivorous. So they can extremely quickly degrade habitat because they just kind of tear through plants and animals non-discriminately. One of the projects I want to share with you today is this project that I did in collaboration with a few entities here in Southern California. And it's really a question of trying to figure out how crayfish are affecting stream health and functioning. And I have to say, I have been very fortunate in my career to work with incredible collaborators, including the US Geological Survey, USGS, the LA Regional Water Board, the Los Virgenes Municipal Water District, local land trusts, and colleagues at UCLA and Pepperdine. And I've also got to say that this has included students as well, students at Pepperdine, students at UCLA, students at Cal State Channel Islands. The students, they're super passionate about making a difference today, and it's great to work with them to prevent these biodiversity losses and work towards that goal collectively and collaboratively as a group. So a huge thank you to my collaborators here. This is me with some of those students working in a stream collecting data on the stream biodiversity, the stream health. And you'll see one of the students in the bottom left there has got his palm out. He's holding an amphibian there. That's our California newt. And then we've got some nets in the stream to survey the invertebrates. And that's what we do. We just kind of work up the stream and we take incremental measurements of biodiversity. And at the same time, we're also working in these streams to remove the crayfish. And this is how you have to remove crayfish. So this is a trap, a minnow trap on the bottom left that's been baited with some like milk bone dog biscuits. And you put this in the stream. You can put some sardines. I mean, there's some dog food. It's, you know, not that tricky. You put it in this little pouch and within 15, 20 minutes, you have a number of crayfish like you see in the photo here that fill up that trap. That is the density of these crayfish in streams. And those traps get set, they get repeatedly set, they get pulled out. The crayfish are then taken, they're humanely euthanized and provided to wildlife health centers to feed rescued wild animals. And I want to say that removal really does make a difference. So for those that are skeptical of like, oh, how big of a difference can it make? It makes a big difference. And there are data that I'm happy to share afterwards or point you in the direction of publications that show this effort does make a difference for amphibian reproductive success, the number of eggs that are deposited by amphibians, and stream biodiversity. And I'm going to share some of those results with you in a minute. We've been working in streams across the Santa Monica Mountains, and this is a map of the streams that are found in the Santa Monica Mountains, and some of them where we have specifically worked with those partners I mentioned. We started tracking and surveying streams across the Santa Monica Mountains to understand what was happening with ecosystem health. And so let me just break this figure down for you real quick. This legend here shows you there are these streams that are just highlighted in white here, where there are no crayfish. And that's juxtaposed against these streams with the sort of dashed lines where there are crayfish present. One thing to note here is that this is the largest watershed in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's called the Malibu Creek Watershed. It's connected, and crayfish have kind of just invaded and moved through this whole watershed. We worked in some of these streams where crayfish are present, and we sampled in these reaches. That's what these letters are showing, different sites that we've sampled with crayfish. The red lines are crayfish sites that we sampled. And then the yellow lines are sites that we sampled where there are no crayfish. And while we were doing this work, we started to notice, my collaborators and I, we started to notice a very distinct pattern in the data. And that data, what it largely started to show us was that in streams without crayfish, this is the comparison we're looking at first. This is an average abundance of mosquito larvae. So before mosquitoes are flying around and biting you and driving you crazy, they are aquatic larvae, and just like the dragonflies. What we were finding in streams without crayfish is that there were no mosquito larvae in our surveys, in our data sets. But there were a ton of odonate dragonfly and damselfly nymphs or larvae. But that pattern was very different in streams with crayfish. There were significantly greater numbers of mosquito larvae on average in streams with crayfish, and significantly reduced numbers of those odonate nymphs. The odonates are, again, the dragonflies and damselflies. And we had a very clear hypothesis about why this might be. And that was because before these dragonflies are flying around and they are in their aquatic stage, and this is not to scale, the dragonfly nymphs and the odonate nymphs, they are actually extremely voracious predators in those streams. And they actually eat a ton of mosquito larvae. And what we thought from this pattern is that this is a really interesting result, because what it's telling us is that there is potential ecological impacts that have largely remained overlooked that pertain to how invasive species may actually negatively impact stream ecosystem services, and in this case, lead to a higher disease risk for humans, because mosquitoes are human disease vectors. And there was a very good reason as to why this would happen. And we used lab experiments to figure this out. So let me just break this figure down for you, and I'm going to give you some takeaways at the bottom. So what we found from some laboratory experiments that we performed to test our ideas, that our hypotheses, that these dragonflies were actually the larvae were eating all of the mosquitoes, and that potentially in streams with crayfish, that was not happening because there were so many fewer dragonfly nymphs and odonates in general because of crayfish. We tested this, we did this experiment, and what we found is that when you look at the proportion of mosquito larvae that are consumed by dragonflies, so let's just say this is, you could think about this as a percentage, but it's a proportion. So let's just say we had 100 larvae for dragonfly nymphs to consume. This is a treatment here where we just have dragonfly nymphs able to eat the mosquito larvae. You can see that very few, they are consuming on average nearly 100% of the mosquito larvae that they are provided, okay? So the first takeaway from this is that dragonflies are actually voracious predators of mosquito larvae. So they leave a very small proportion of mosquito larvae living. They consume a lot of them. Now, when we look at just crayfish, we did this same experiment, but we replaced the dragonfly nymphs with crayfish. When you give the crayfish the mosquito larvae to consume, they are not very good at consuming the mosquito larvae. In fact, dragonflies are 20 times more efficient at consuming and killing the mosquito larvae compared to crayfish alone. So that's our second takeaway, that crayfish actually are garbage at consuming mosquito larvae. They are extremely inefficient predators of mosquito larvae. The third way that we tested this is we wanted to see, okay, under ecologically realistic conditions, they're probably going to coexist. We found them together in streams. And that's really the kicker here, is that when you put the two together and you give them the same amount of food as in these other treatments, crayfish actually negate the presence of the dragonflies. The benefit of having the dragonflies is completely reduced because the dragonflies become inefficient predators in the presence of the crayfish. In essence, the crayfish actually make the dragonfly seem like it is essentially absent from the ecosystem when they're present. And that's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it points to what we call a trophic cascade. And that's basically saying that the presence of crayfish alters the biotic interactions. So crayfish being present affects the mosquitoes and their ability to consume the dragonfly, the mosquito larvae. The loss of a species can lead to a very different ecosystem and interactions between species. And that is what we're talking about when we think about a trophic cascade. In this case, the dragonflies, even being there, are essentially absent. So they are, for lack of larger explanation, essentially absent, and the ecosystem becomes very different because the crayfish affect the interactions between the predators of the mosquitoes, the dragonfly nymphs consuming the mosquito larvae. They essentially cause them to stop foraging is what happens, or they directly just kill them. This is actually quite significant for Southern California. We have at least 16 mosquito species that are found in Southern California. I show you 3 groups, which we call genera. Each one is a genus. And I show you the genera and the diseases that they're known to actually vector to humans. So these are the human diseases that are vectored by mosquitoes, which include West Nile virus, WNV there, things like Zika, the encephalitis viruses, yellow fever, dengue, malaria. And these have consequences to human health. And this is directly related to what's happening in the stream ecosystems. I want to show you this figure from a publication in 2008 that shows the history of emerging infectious disease events from 1940 to 2004. And there are hotspots shown there. There's the number of infectious emerging infectious disease events. EID on this refers to emerging infectious disease events. So the smaller the circle, the fewer the number of emerging infectious disease events. The larger the circle, the greater the number. The takeaway from this is that hotspots, which are kind of zoomed in here, with this inset panel. They are tending to occur in regions with high human population densities. And one of the leading causes of these outbreaks is due to vector-borne pathogens. And this would include many diseases that are actually transmitted by mosquitoes. And as a result, this is the reason why we invest so much effort, resources into maintaining and controlling mosquito populations and trying to eradicate them. I want to share with you a very interesting study. This kind of builds off of the research I just shared with you that looked at how invasive crayfish affect biodiversity and impact ecosystems relative to extreme events like wildfire. So the question here is largely, do invasive species have a greater impact on ecosystems than something as big as a major wildfire like the Woolsey fire that occurred in 2018 in the Santa Monica Mountains? The image in the triangle is the wildfire progressing actually east towards Malibu Canyon, which is shown here. This is about Malibu Canyon right here. That's where the fire stopped. But this red, this darkest red or dark brown is actually showing you the burn scar of the Woolsey fire. And then this purple or black dashed line is showing you the border of the Santa Monica Mountains. This was a huge wildfire that pretty much consumed 90,000 acres and burned the entire western extent of the Santa Monica Mountains. So north is actually this direction, given how the shape of the coast is. So the whole western extent largely of the Santa Monica Mountains burned, where this was left unburned. And as director of research at Stunt Ranch, the biological field station in the Santa Monica Mountains, which is part of the UC Natural Reserve System of biological field stations, I get a chance to provide some research opportunities, some field-based research opportunities to students. And here are two of them that worked with me over the last few summers. The woman on the right, her name is Bianca. She's actually leading in the photo on the right, the biodiversity surveying effort, which is basically you have a transect, you go to 15 different spots or 10 different spots in a stream that are separated by 15-meter increments. You stick a net in there, you scoop up the insects that are in the stream there, and then you go back and you identify them. Bianca specifically wanted to understand how the Woolsey fire affected stream biodiversity and what degree the streams with and without crayfish that were either burned or unburned by the Woolsey fire, how the biodiversity in those groups actually recovered post-fire. Again, the question being, what happens with stream biodiversity as a result of fire, and is that different than the presence of crayfish? Largely what she found, I'm going to walk you through. Biodiversity was no different in burned versus unburned streams. This panel is part of her analysis. And what you're looking at are these polygons. And each point on the polygon, this is a really cool analysis that describes variation in your data set and patterns in those data using 2D space. And all you really need to take away from this is that each point on the polygon is a site, and when sites are more clustered, they have more similarity. And so each of these sites are either unburned, so Topanga, Cold Creek, Tuna, and Cold Creek Lower were unburned, whereas sites like Solstice, Arroyo, Trancas, and Malibu were burned. And you see that largely they cluster together. And the takeaway is that there's no significant differences between sites due to the effect of fire. So this is showing you the effect of fire. But what you notice is there are these red streams labeled where there were crayfish. The red denotes crayfish sites. And there were tons of crayfish at these two sites and few to none at this site. And what you see is they're very different, these two specifically with tons of crayfish, from these sites that were either burned or unburned. And when you perform this analysis and you account for the presence of crayfish, what you actually find is that they have a significant effect on biodiversity. Sites with the large number of crayfish, Malibu and Topanga, have biodiversity that is very different from the sites with no crayfish. And the takeaway is that there are significant biodiversity differences due to crayfish. And this site, Trancas, where there were few to none, implies that removal can improve biodiversity. This is a project that is much larger and has been ongoing with crayfish removal and trying to understand their impacts. And it's been a big success in sites where we have removed hundreds of thousands of crayfish, literally. It has assisted the National Park Service in management strategies, and it's also favored the recovery of federally endangered species. So there are huge wins from doing this work. It's a lot of work, but it's really beneficial. I want to end on this idea. This is about the relevance of losing species and biodiversity loss. And this is a question I often get, which is, who cares if a single bug or insect or fish or amphibian or mammal goes extinct? Who cares? Well, losing species has consequences, and I hope that I've demonstrated that with these data today, that losing dragonflies because of invasive crayfish has consequences, not just to the ecosystem services in general, but to human health specifically. Killer dragonflies that eat all of those mosquito larvae benefit us because they suppress the populations of human disease vectoring mosquitoes. And that ecosystem service means that we likely will have a lower probability of human diseases like West Nile virus that are vectored by mosquitoes having a big impact on our population. But losing species has consequences. And just like losing species has consequences and species can go extinct, ecosystems can be lost too. And this is the last thought I want to share with you, which is thinking about this idea of ecosystem collapse. It's not to incite panic or fear, but it's just to say that we have distinct ecosystems which are highly ecoregion specific. Deserts, chaparral communities, ephemeral streams. Those ecosystems can be lost, just like species can be lost. So the IUCN, the International Union on the Conservation of Nature, has a red list of species. You've probably heard of it, IUCN red list of species that says like, here's a species that's near extinction. It's of high conservation priority. The IUCN also has a list of red list ecosystems that, just like those IUCN red list of species, identifies unique ecosystems that are in peril. There are a couple dozen of them right now listed. And I just want to share with you my thoughts that I feel we are actually looking at an ecosystem collapsing and potentially being lost in Southern California, which is our very unique ephemeral stream ecosystems. This idea of ecosystem collapse, just to give you the broad picture of it, it's not that like it doesn't exist and it's completely lost per se. It's that it transitions to a completely different and distinct ecosystem from what it was before. So as an example, if you had like a marsh ecosystem that somehow was rare and then it became flooded, that ecosystem has collapsed because it is no longer a marsh ecosystem. It has transitioned to a lake ecosystem, right? So you could think about this like when people build dams, they turn river ecosystems into pond or lake ecosystems that were never there before. So the ecosystem that was there has collapsed or transformed. And I just want to walk you through, there are 4 mechanisms that I think are worth noting how our ecosystems, and this can be applied to numerous ecosystems, it's just not stream ecosystems, that are used, these mechanisms that are used to assess the risk that a characteristic ecosystem is possibly going to be lost. And so there's a declining distribution of the species. And so I think that's pretty clear given the data I showed you with aquatic species in Southern California. The habitat is being lost quickly because of prolonged drought and land use change. Another tool is assessing if there is a restricted distribution. Well, aquatic species are limited by nature to aquatic habitat, which based on the declining distribution mechanism is in fact the case, that the aquatic species are limited by habitat and that distribution is restricted as a result of that. And then that there is a degradation of the abiotic environment. Well, that's apparent because we know that invasive species have degraded streams. I showed you that crayfish are omnivorous, and as a result of their presence in streams, they kind of obliterate the biota. And as kind of reference, the scholar Jared Diamond has referred to crayfish as A-bomb assaults on amphibians because it's like a nuclear scene when they expand and take over an ecosystem. They just degrade the entire environment. And then the fourth is this idea of assessing if we see altered biotic interactions. And in this case, yes, given the example with crayfish and mosquitoes, the invasive species negatively affect native species and as a result, compromise ecosystem services. So I just want to say to end, we know what we need to do. We need to work to protect our resources and prevent this idea of collapse or our ecosystems transitioning to something very different than they are today. And that can be done by working to save our streams by preventing the spread of invasive species, not releasing pets, goldfish included, into the wild, turtles into the wild, crayfish into the wild, and actually finding conservation groups locally where you can help to remove invasive species. I think those 3 things are key to helping to protect our resources and saving our streams. And I just want to thank the organizers again for allowing me to spotlight this topic. And I provide my email address here if you'd like to contact me with follow-up questions. And I'm happy to answer questions now in the Q&A session. And I put a little salamander up there, our California newt, to say thank you to all of you for attending and taking the time to hear me. So thanks.
All right, yeah, thanks, Gary, for the fascinating talk. We have some questions for you. First one is from Adriana, and she wants to know, are crayfish edible? Could harvesting them as a food source reduce the population?
Yeah, it is a really great question to ask because it seems like it should be that easy. Just capture all of these and eat them. Okay, so there's a caveat to this, that crayfish can rapidly bioaccumulate heavy metals. And so that makes it a little problematic to just generally say, go eat them. Now, we do capture them and generally, give them to wildlife health recovery centers to feed those animals. And none of those animals have ever shown any signs of like negative effects from heavy metal contaminants or something like that. So I would say, if you're eager to try them and have some gumbo, go for it. Just maybe get them tested. I would highly recommend that before you start eating them. They can also be harbors of parasites too. But I have always had this vision with colleagues at Pepperdine to just like get this giant cauldron and put the damn thing on PCH, like right at the busiest intersection, and just have like the largest craw boil. And I think the demand would be so high that that would just kind of obliterate those populations quickly. But if anybody wants to collaborate on that, drop me a message.
All right, and we got another question from Olivia. She's concerned about invasives on her property, invasive plants. She says she doesn't think invasive insects are an issue, but she's asking, are you aware of any grants or support for property owners that are interested in improving the stream ecosystem on their properties?
Yeah, and you can contact your vector control agencies. At least in Los Angeles, there are tons of resources that can be found through like vector control agencies. I will say, you do not want to have vector control agents come onto your property and release, they're called mosquito fish. This has often been done as a practice because the idea is that the mosquito fish, as you would think their name implies, they'll consume a lot of mosquito larvae, but they don't. They actually, unfortunately, go after amphibian eggs and tadpoles. So, you know, I've been working with groups locally to try and stop that practice. So just be thinking about like, okay, if I introduce this species, like, is there a potential for negative ramifications? But there are tons of resources available through your city. You can also just check in and give your city hall a call to find out what programs they have for improving biodiversity on your land.
Dr. Bucciarelli, if I can interject, because I hail from the Central Coast, there's a wonderful network of resource conservation districts, since the Central Coast is mostly rural. And I would suggest, if you don't live in a municipality, that would be your next course to ask about technical assistance or grants.
Absolutely. Thanks, Julie. Yeah, that's a great point.
All right, and we got another question from Anna. What measures should be taken when hiking in multiple streams to prevent spread of the invasive species?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I just focused on crayfish. So obviously, like, don't take crayfish from one stream and have it for a pet for a few days and then, you know, introduce it into another stream. That could be really detrimental, especially if it were a female that had eggs on it. The other is there are numerous invasive species throughout California that are aquatic. And one of them that tends to be quite abundant and problematic is New Zealand mud snails. So these are very, very small invertebrates that, you know, can be as small as a period on a newspaper. And they, if you walk through streams or muddy waters or even wet water while hiking, the eggs and the larvae can actually attach to your shoes and then be transported if you don't clean them properly in between sites. But this goes for plants too, like plant seeds, right? They hitchhike on your clothes. So, you know, you just want to be responsible. I think the plant world has been really successful at this, saying like, clean off seeds from your shoes before you go hiking in another place. Don't let those seeds hijack. Well, we need to be as proactive with aquatic ecosystems. And one way you can do that is dipping your shoes in a bleach solution of like 10 to 20% bleach, or even better, just freezing them for 24 hours. That will work too. But we also have like fungal pathogens that are transmitted from stream to stream. So it's just always good practice. If you go to one stream and you're going to go to another, clean your shoes thoroughly by freezing and bleaching before you go to another site.
Yeah, good to know. And we got a question from Donald. Can a crayfish predator be introduced, or would this create a new problem?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, Donald. And I can just say anecdotally, like we've had some success in systems that are closed, so like ponds and or lakes, where crayfish have been prolific, but there are actually fish in there too, and game fish specifically, like smallmouth, largemouth bass, catfish, centrarchids. What we've actually found is that those closed systems, those ponds, the fish actually do a really great job of eating all of those crayfish and keeping the population down really low. So we've done things where we've had ponds specifically where, you know, we've let the fish kind of keep going and hammering the crayfish populations, then electroshocked the pond to get rid of the fish, and then let like Western pond turtles and other native herps, amphibians and reptiles repopulate that stream, or we've done translocations. Streams, it's really hard to do that because it's a non-closed system, right? They can go up and down the stream and into other branches, like I showed you on the map of the Malibu Creek watershed. So they can proliferate, and then it becomes extremely difficult to manage. So unfortunately, in stream ecosystems, our glorious, wonderful, ephemeral streams in Southern California, the hazard associated with introductions of a potential predator is, you know, very, very, very risky.
And then we have a question from someone. Do you have a list of the species found in the creeks available?
Of the stream invertebrates and amphibians?
I'm assuming.
Sure. Yeah, across the Santa Monica Mountains, both are readily available. And actually, I think they're on the Stunt Ranch website, which we can share that link. But if you just Google Stunt Ranch Reserve, you'll find data as a tab, and then there's a link for amphibians and reptiles, and also aquatic invertebrates or insects generally.
Great. And then we have a question from Carolyn. Oh, and Doug just put that link in the chat. Thanks, Doug. Carolyn's asking, are any viable streams likely to dry up due to the drought?
Well, what I didn't share with you about Bianca's project, which was to look at the burned and unburned streams, we had like 16 streams that we had planned to sample. And I don't know if you counted the number of streams, probably not on those two-dimensional graphs I showed you. We only ended up getting 8 because when we started in May, half of them were already dried up. And last year was really, really hard in terms of drought. This year has been really hard too, but thankfully we had our March miracle and we did get some rainfall in the Santa Monica Mountains. So they do dry up really quick. And honestly, May is extremely early, and it has consequences.
All right, yeah, we're about through all the questions. We've got 3 more if you want to burn through them.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so question from Jay. So by extension of your species loss message, can you speculate the significant consequences of loss of the delta smelt?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is not, so full disclosure, like I work in streams and I am not a fish person. I only, know the bad ones, which are the introduced trout, the introduced centrarchids, the catfish, etc. So I am not 100% familiar with what is happening currently with the delta smelt. I will say that these are the types of questions that we need to be asking though. Like, this is why we need to fund conservation research. Who would have ever thought that losing a dragonfly would make any difference in how, our human well-being is affected? Who knows what those smelt eat? Maybe they like mosquitoes too, maybe they eat invasive species. There are always surprises to be had by doing this research. And I think it's just a further reason to continue to do this sort of working. And for those that are on that are students or young scholars early in their career, go answer these questions, find out what's going on in these systems.
All right, and then we got a question from Donald. How are the values determined for the cost of ecosystem services provided?
Yeah, it's a very thorough process, and it goes all the way from air purification to air conditioning to, recreational enjoyment. There are several papers I can provide links to if people would like to see them, but there's one specific one that if you Google on Google Scholar, you will find, which if it's simply ecosystem services, estimated costs, Los Angeles, and it will come up. There's one specific study on that, which I can share if there's a follow-up link or something like that. Okay.
All right, and last question is from Donald. Are introduced species intentionally introduced, unintentionally, or both?
Yeah, I think it's both. And certainly with crayfish in the Santa Monica Mountains, the way they were introduced was people in Los Angeles came to the Santa Monica Mountains in the 30s, 40s, 50s to get away from the urban environment and sort of recreate, sport fish. And it was those sport fishers that were going to these ponds that were built in the Santa Monica Mountains, taking bait and then releasing the bait. And crayfish were bait at that point. So they thought they were doing the right thing, like I'll save this crayfish. And they were, non-intentionally introduced to do negative. They thought they were doing a good thing, but it was, turns out something bad. And that's what I was referring to about this idea of lag effects, that introduced or a non-native species can be introduced like the crayfish were originally, but because there is no evolutionary history and no natural predators, they just become exponentially abundant and become invasive.
All right, yeah, thank you, Gary. That's all the questions. Hey, Julie.
Great.
And thank you, Gary. And thanks to each of you for attending today's session. We look forward to having you join us, hopefully, in the next 2 days. And be well and be vigilant for invasive species.
Yes. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.